This time I would like to talk about what I call the axioms of mental processes. First of all, I think there is much point again in dividing mental activity into conscious and unconscious. I often return to this division between the conscious and the unconscious because it appears very frequently, even in mass culture. However, the issue is that every individual person has a different degree of what they are aware of about themselves and what they are not aware of. And these states, as it seems to me, exist in a constant dynamic condition. They can move from consciousness to the unconscious, and from the unconscious to consciousness. There are also clearly different degrees of awareness. I did not start exactly with this topic, but I believe it is important to dwell on it in more detail, because a great deal of what follows wilt on this idea. When I speak about mental processes, I mean their totality. What a person realizes at a given moment, what they do not realize, and what they may potentially realize or never realize. Because if we try to reason about these processes, it becomes extremely difficult to examine one layer independently of another. It is difficult to consider them horizontally, so to speak, because this is always a moving system. I believe it is necessary to mark this point. Now let us return to what I call axioms of mental processes. What is an axiom? We all know from school mathematics that an axiom is something that does not require proof. It is something accepted as it is because it appears obvious to people. Parallel lines do not intersect, at least in Euclidean geometry. We will not go into those nuances here. In other words, we need something on which we rely when constructing everything else, something that is not disputed. Recently, I watched a lecture by a mathematician who explained that we cannot actually define the number 1. What is it? Yet, we still use it. If we move to mental processes, the situation becomes even more complicated. Not only are some things impossible to define precisely, but we also cannot physically perceive or measure them directly. Nevertheless, there exist certain established ideas about how the psyche functions internally. Let us take something simple, the feeling of fear. Something that threatens our life causes an unpleasant sensation that we define as fear. If we think more deeply about this, some external process occurs which we interpret as threatening to us physically. Apparently, this interpretation comes partly from experience. Although in the previous video I mentioned that some things frighten us even without experience, something that Kant would call a priori knowledge. So some external phenomenon causes an emotion within us. We treat this as an axiom. For example, the anticipation of death produces fear. In everyday life, we rely heavily on such assumptions when analyzing human behavior. We assume that in a particular situation, the psyche will react in a particular way. This example is very basic because it is easier to start with fundamental reactions. Yet even at this level there are exceptions. Everyone knows that there are people who are not afraid of death, or people who are not afraid of pain. Thus, even this axiom already contains exceptions. If we move to more complex psychological reactions, the number of exceptions increases. Take the example of gratitude. People generally assume that if you do something good for someone, that person will later feel grateful. This also functions like an axiom, but it is a more complex axiom. Naturally, there are exceptions. Some people are simply ungrateful. Yet the general assumption remains that the human psyche has the property of gratitude in response to kindness. Let us attempt to draw a parallel with mathematics. 1 + 1 = 2. We can demonstrate this by taking two bananas and placing them together. But if we speak about an action directed toward another person, an action that improves their condition, why should the psyche respond by wanting to return the favor? This is not obvious fact. It seems to be simply one possible way the psyche reacts. And the fact it is only one possibility is proven by the existence of people who do not react in this way. The further we move from simple reactions toward more complex ones, the greater the number of exceptions becomes, and the less predictable the outcome is. Therefore, I want to emphasize again, the reactions that we believe people must have, the reactions we consider axiomatic, are in fact highly ambiguous. Try for a moment to imagine that you have no predetermined expectations about how others will react. Imagine that you truly do not know how another person will respond to your behavior. Let us move to an even more complex example. Since everything I discuss ultimately relates to improving human life, often from a somewhat medical perspective, let us consider the explanation of internal conflicts. The concept of an internal conflict itself is essentially a metaphor borrowed from observable physical conflicts and projected onto mental processes. Of course, it may partially reflect reality. After all, most sciences that deal with abstract phenomena tend to explain them through analogies with things we can physically observe. If we say that the reason for someone's behavior lies in an internal conflict, why do we accept this explanation so easily? When analyzing a person's life, or even when watching a film, we often enjoy explaining characters' motivations in psychological terms. We construct chains of reasoning, childhood experiences, personality traits, conflicts, and finally behavior. People find satisfaction in such explanations because they appear coherent and logical. But let us try to see this differently. Take a common assumption. If someone had a difficult childhood, they may become an angry or hostile person. Why should negative experiences in childhood necessarily lead to harming others later in life? We consider this obvious, yet it may not be. Let us imagine that we encounter the human psyche as something completely unknown, like a complex program whose internal structure we do not understand. We observe inputs and outputs, but we do not know the internal mechanisms. For example, it is often said that if a person feels dissatisfied with themselves, they compensate by humiliating others. Again, this is considered self-evident. But if we look closely, we are connecting two extremely vague psychological phenomena with an even less defined mechanism. What does it mean to be dissatisfied with oneself? What exactly does it mean to humiliate another person? And how exactly does one compensate for the other? Yet we treat this relationship as obvious. Probably because we observe patterns that suggest it may sometimes work that way. For example, someone who cannot jump very high might exaggerate their ability. Then they may attempt to lower others' achievements so that the difference between themselves and others becomes smaller. In that case, we can interpret their behavior as an attempt to reduce inequality between themselves and others. This begins to move towards something more concrete. If individuals have similar capabilities, they gain similar access to resources. In fact, many ecological processes may ultimately be reduced to the desire to obtain equal or greater access to resources compared to others who compete for those resources. Again, my goal on this channel is not primarily to answer questions, but to ask them. I may sometimes contradict myself or change my position during a discussion, because many of these ideas are formed spontaneously. Often a thought becomes clear only when I reach the end of explaining it. Nevertheless, I believe that many psychological reactions are connected to basic needs and access to resources. Yet even here questions remain. For instance, why does a person who has experienced suffering sometimes feel that others should suffer as well? How does that improve their access to resources? This is a difficult question, and I will leave it open for now. Another important point concerns how we form expectations about psychological reactions. Much of what we believe about human psychology comes not from direct observation, but from media, films, stories, news, and other representations of reality. These narratives shape what we believe people should feel or how they should react. Thus, the patterns of psychological reactions we expect are often learned from external sources. This brings us back to the question of consciousness and unconscious influence. People frequently absorb behavioral patterns from society without realizing it. Consider the example of revenge. In many cultures, the idea of blood revenge was once deeply embedded. People were taught that in certain situations revenge was the appropriate reaction. Today, this reaction is largely discouraged because it is socially destructive. Historically, however, revenge could lead to endless cycles of violence. Even now, societies attempt to suppress private vengeance and replace it with institutional justice. In essence, this brings us close to Freud's concept of the superego, the internalization of external expectations. The self attempts to conform to what society considers acceptable. From a scientific perspective, it would be interesting to measure how strongly different individuals are influenced by external norms. People vary in their sensitivity to such influences, and the intensity of these influences may change over time. But perhaps the most troubling point is this. It is often impossible to determine whether a reaction that feels natural to us actually originates from our own psyche or from external conditioning. Therefore, I would like to conclude with the following thought. When you experience a strong feeling that a particular reaction is absolutely correct, when you feel that you must act in a certain way, that certainty itself may be the first signal that the reaction deserves deeper examination. It may be worth analyzing what components form that reaction and where they truly come from.